In this movie, we begin a fun little subsection on working with camera movement. Now, camera movement in Anime Studio Pro is very easy to do. However, something that goes hand in hand with it is how to actually set up your scene to be camera movement friendly, because there's certain do's and don'ts that you need to know when you're setting up a camera to move in 3D space through a scene that uses 2D types of artwork. We've looked at 3D in the other special arts section, but this time we're going to have camera movements going through a 3D scene that is made entirely of 2D art. We've got our basic window open that you can see whenever you launch Anime Studio Pro, and it's got the default character Windsor in it with some pre-made animations. So he's got his movements in there. We'll have a little fun with this since we're dealing with anime and we're dealing with a character that may or may not be Asian. We're going to do a Godzilla themed thing. We'll have a cityscape and Mount Fuji in the background, some trees, and as we do a camera movement into the scene, at the very end we'll have everything shaking, just like Godzilla was walking very close by. So first of all, let's go ahead and establish our ground layer, the grass layer. I'll create a new vector layer. I'll double click on it and we'll rename it grass so we can identify it easily. And I'm going to go ahead and back my camera out, or I should say the view area, just a little bit. I'll come over to the square and I'm simply going to draw a basic square. I'll shift, click and drag so we get a perfect square right there. I'll go ahead and push keyboard shortcut T and we'll center this on the layer. And then I need to change the colors of it. Keyboard shortcut Q. I'll change the white to a green that's a little more grass-like. And we'll disable the outline right now so we don't need to see that. Come back to T for translate. Now, of course, we don't need grass in our face, so as we learned in the particle section, we need to take this layer and actually rotate the layer 90 degrees on the x-axis. So down in the layer tool, we'll come down to rotate layer on the x-axis, and that's because it goes horizontally across the scene. I'll enter a value of 90. And we see that it's appearing from this view right in the middle of Windsor. Well, this is where 3D scene building with 2D objects gets a little bit funny. And one thing you need to be aware of is that when we do this with a rotated plane like this for grass, we can't use the anime feature of sort by layer depth, because the center of this layer is right in the center of Windsor. And as we get other things that recede back in space, if we chose that option that's available here in the project settings, where we've got the option right here, sort layers by depth, if that's enabled, then what happens is that the grass always appears in front of everything that would be behind the character of Windsor. So I'll select cancel here. What we need to do then is put this in 3D space so it's somewhat believable. So we'll do most of this by eye. I'll switch to the 2 view here. It reset our camera, and in this highlighted view, you can tell by the gray surround, I'm going to change the view from what is the camera view to the front view. This changes perspective a little bit. I'll come down here to my layer translation tool, and for the layer value here, I'm just going to enter something to start with, something like -10, and gosh, that looks like that went too far. How about -5? We see our layer coming up a little bit, maybe layer 3. Now when we look in this view on the right side, we see that the grass apparently is covering up our character, and it looks like that's what's going on here too in the front view. Well, that's not exactly what's happening. What's happening is because, of course, the grass layer is ahead of our character. So I'll select the grass layer and drag it below the Windsor layer, and now Windsor appears to be on top of it. There is no real contact between the character and the grass, but we want to make it look like that everything makes sense the way it's set up. The next thing is this grass is far too small, so let's go ahead and change the scale of the scene here. Come over to our Scale Select tool. The default value is 1, which really, again, is kind of a meaningless number. It's just a starting point. We want to increase this, let's say, by a factor of 10. So I'm going to enter 10 for the X value. I'll tab over to the next window, 10 for the Y value. Tab over to the Z, and again 10, and I'll press Enter. So now we've got a very large field of grass to move around in. With this view selected, if I change my view to the top, we'll see that we have quite a large scene. We can see right here very carefully where the camera is. It's looking at our character, and our character, because it's two-dimensional, is quite hard to see. To get a better sense of how everything's set up in the scene, we can come down to our workspace tool, keyboard shortcut 9, and press Orbit. And when we select the window here, we get a better sense of where everything is in our scene and how large it is. Using the Orbit tool is going to become very important as we go ahead and set our scene up. Well, let's add some other elements to our scene. We need a cityscape, so let's do File, Import, Adobe Illustrator file. You can go ahead and go over to the working files under camera movement. We've got city buildings. They will look familiar because we, after all, as it wakes one of the discs up there, use them in another scene. So our buildings come in, but they come in right at Z depth, the distance from the camera to the character, it's 0. Well, that's not going to work for us. So let's go ahead and do the same thing that we did with the grass. We're going to use the Scale tool. And in this case, I'm just going to grab one of the handles and click and drag. We'll make this bigger. They're quite large, in fact. Now I want this to go back in Z depth. So I'm going to select the Layer Translation tool. And under our Z scale, I'm going to say -10. So now they go a little bit further back and we see them behind our character. As we use the Orbit tool right here in this window, we can see that we could probably push them back even further and make the scene just a little bit larger. We may choose to do that, but first we'll get in some of the other elements in the scene. We'll pick that up in our next movie.